Dad died last night. As the eldest, I'm taking the house and the entire estate. You are not getting a single dime. Pack up your military duffel and get the hell out of there today." Accompanying the cold command from Vanessa, my biological older sister, was a barbaric chuckle from my brother-in-law, bleeding through the phone's speaker. Finally getting rid of that bitch. Not a single sob, just a cruel overflowing glee while announcing her own father's death. I froze, not out of grief, but because at this exact moment, Colonel Arthur, our dead father, was sitting exactly 3 feet away from me. The old veteran's proud eyes instantly shattered at the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. He slowly placed the silver star medal in his hand down on the table, leaned close to the phone's microphone, his voice heavy. But before I reveal the sentence that left her dead in her tracks, if you are curious to know how a veteran responds from the dead, take a second to hit like and subscribe. And leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is. Your company is the driving force for me to keep telling this story. Colonel Arthur leaned forward, his elbows planting hard against the island counter. The tendons in his neck pulled tight, rigid like old steel cables beneath his weathered skin. His jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. He spoke into the microphone, enunciating every single syllable with a quiet, lethal precision. "No, Vanessa. I am still breathing." The other end of the line dropped into a dead vacuum. The faint background noise of a television morning show vanished. Derek's nasty little laugh choked off in his throat, dying out exactly like a dog getting kicked in the ribs. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, click. Vanessa hung up. She did not ask how he was feeling. She did not stumble over a panicked apology for the gruesome mistake. She just cut the line. That hollow rhythmic dial tone echoing out of the speakerphone was infinitely more vicious than any screamed curse word. It confirmed the ugly, naked truth. She was terrified because her Ohio gold mine was still drawing breath, not relieved that her father had survived the night. I stood perfectly still by the refrigerator, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I watched the 68-year-old man sitting on the stool. I tracked his physiological response. His broad shoulders, the same ones that carried a loaded rucksack across foreign deserts, simply caved in. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell. I did not rush over to throw my arms around him. I did not offer any empty garbage platitudes like, "It is going to be okay." I am a combat medic. I spent tours patching up Marines who had been blown half to hell. When a man takes shrapnel to the gut, your panic only makes him bleed out faster. Hysterics kill. Right now, my father needed a sentry on duty, not a weeping daughter. I took a deliberate step back, giving him a physical perimeter to protect whatever scrap of dignity he had left. I pulled out a wooden chair, grabbed a damp microfiber rag, and went back to scrubbing a water stain off a brass eagle trophy on the shelf. I kept my movements slow, methodical. I used absolute suffocating silence to keep his heart rate from spiking into the red zone. The only sound in the room was the harsh, rhythmic friction of cloth scraping against metal. My peripheral vision stayed deadlocked on the orange plastic prescription bottle sitting on the edge of the granite countertop. Nitroglycerin pills. If his chest seized, if he grabbed his left arm, I was ready to move. But until then, I held the line. I let him process the betrayal in the quiet. Arthur stared blankly at the empty space above the stainless steel sink. The hands that had gripped an M16 rifle through 2 brutal conflicts were now visibly shaking. He reached a trembling, liver-spotted hand toward the orange pill bottle, hesitated, and then stopped. He shoved it away with a bitter, disgusted swipe of his knuckles. His silver star lay abandoned on the cold, polished granite, the ribbon slightly frayed at the edges. For decades, he had built a massive fortress of excuses for his eldest daughter. He called her relentless greed, youthful ambition. He called her manipulative selfishness, fierce independence. He always covered her tracks. That phone call at 7:20 in the morning took a sledgehammer to his glass house. The enemy was not shooting from across a trench in some foreign dirt. The enemy was sitting in an upscale suburb in Cincinnati, holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee carrying the last name Harper. My father bowed his heavy head. His chin dropped toward his chest, his gray hair catching the dull morning light. He rubbed his large calloused hands together, the dry skin scraping loudly in the quiet room. It looked like he was desperately trying to generate some friction, trying to find a single shred of warmth from a family that had just flatlined. The kitchen air grew thick, heavy with the stench of betrayal and the bitter smell of stale black coffee in the pot. It felt like breathing underwater. Then the wall-mounted landline shrieked. The harsh electronic ringing sliced right through the silence like a scalpel. Arthur flinched hard, his shoulders jerking up toward his ears, but he did not make a single move to stand. His hollow eyes remained glued to his reflection on the granite counter. I tossed the rag onto the table. I walked over, pulling the heavy plastic receiver off the cradle. Harper Residence. The voice on the other end was gravelly, deliberate, and entirely stripped of pleasantries. Theodore Sterling, a retired military judge and the family's estate lawyer, a man who never called before 9 in the morning unless the sky was falling. Lexi, Theodore said, his tone dropping an octave. Get the colonel down to my office right now. Someone just called the firm. They impersonated a hospital administrator, reported the colonel as deceased, and demanded the immediate unsealing of the estate assets. My grip tightened on the plastic receiver until my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. The muscles in my jaw locked tight. Understood. We are on our way. I slammed the phone back onto the wall hook. The sharp plastic crack echoed off the tile walls. I turned to look at the old Marine sitting in the shadows of the breakfast nook. The enemy had just crossed the wire. The real war was officially on. I steered the heavy SUV through the frost-covered streets of our Ohio suburb. The heater blasted dry air, but it did nothing to cut the chill settling deep in my bones. Not a single word was spoken. The silence inside the cab was thick, almost suffocating. My father sat in the passenger seat, his weathered face turned toward the foggy windshield. He was staring right through the glass, seeing nothing. At 68, his body was a proud ruin, a map of collateral damage. He had a titanium knee from a bad jump in the 80s and faded shrapnel scars crisscrossing his left shoulder. He had put his time in. He had paid his dues in blood. He was supposed to be resting. Arthur finally broke the dead air. His voice was raw, scraped down to the gravel. I am a casualty, Lexi. Worst Tuesday of my damn life. I gripped the leather steering wheel tighter. My knuckles went stark white against the dark gray rim. The sheer, unadulterated bitterness in his voice was the sharpest weapon I had encountered in a decade, and it drove straight into my skull. He was right. He had survived foreign deserts only to catch a bullet in his own kitchen. We pulled into the firm's small asphalt lot. Theodore's office smelled like stale coffee, heavy lemon polish, and 50 years of old paper. It was an old-school legal bunker. Solid oak desk, heavy leather wingback chairs that sighed and swallowed you whole when you sat down. Theodore did not offer us coffee. He did not ask about the weather. He shoved a thick manila folder across the smooth oak surface. Vanessa called 30 minutes ago. Theodore stated, his tone completely stripped of emotion. She put on a hell of a show. Voice cracking, crying on cue. Said she needed to execute the old will from 12 years ago immediately. 12 years ago, the golden era of Vanessa Harper. Back then, she was the untouchable favorite, the golden child who could do no wrong. That old document practically handed her the keys to the kingdom, the house, the savings, the entire estate free and clear. She always assumed that piece of paper was carved in stone. Theodore cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked directly at my father and shook his head slowly. She has no idea you shredded that version 5 years ago, Arthur. She does not know Lexi is designated to protect your interests now. She is no longer holding all the cards. My father let out a dry, hollow exhale. The corner of his mouth twitched up into a completely empty smirk. It was the face of a man looking at a collapsed bridge. But the real gut punch was still waiting. The real damage always hides below the surface. Theodore pulled a single small yellow sticky note from the back of the folder. He laid it flat on the desk. That is not all. 6 months ago, Vanessa and Derek came in here unannounced. Very hushed, very off the record. They started asking aggressive questions about the legal threshold for a conservatorship, about overriding your medical proxy. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. My logistics brain immediately snapped into gear, slamming data points together in a rapid, brutal sequence. 6 months ago. Thanksgiving. while I was eating a cold processed MRE out of a foil pouch on a forward operating base in the Middle East, missing the holidays to do my job. My sister was sitting at the dining room table, carving a turkey. I remembered a specific detail my father had mentioned on a shaky satellite call. During that dinner, Arthur had forgotten the combination to his gun safe. It was a simple slip, a normal brain fart for a guy pushing 70. Derek had been leaning against the door frame, swirling a glass of cheap bourbon. He smirked and said, "Gonna have to revoke your command privileges soon, old man," slipping. Everyone at the table laughed. They brushed it off as a joke, just guys busting chops. It was not a joke. It was a reconnaissance mission. They were probing the perimeter. They were using a family holiday to actively evaluate his cognitive decline, looking for a weak spot in the armor so they could declare him incompetent. They wanted to prove he was losing his mind. They wanted to weaponize the fact that he occasionally forgot to take a pill or walked with a slight limp and use it to lock him in a legal cage. And they knew I was the only physical roadblock stopping them. My father dropped his head into his large, scarred hands. The total collapse of his pride was agonizing to watch. The broad, square shoulders of a Marine colonel visibly sagged under the weight of a daughter's calculated treachery. I did not offer a comforting pat on the back. Empathy was useless here. We needed a strategy. I stepped up to the edge of the heavy oak desk. I reached out and scooped up the heavy ring of keys for the SUV. Clack! The sharp metallic sound of the keys hitting each other snapped through the quiet room like a rifle bolt slamming home. I looked Theodore dead in the eye and gave him a single hard nod. No thanks were necessary between soldiers. I turned to the broken man sitting beside me. "Let's go home, Colonel." The enemy showed their face. "We need to reset the perimeter." Exactly at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy oak front door blew open. It hit the wall stopper with a violent crack. The sharp, rapid clack-clack-clack of stiletto heels hammered against the hardwood hallway. Vanessa rushed into the kitchen. She brought a cloud of sickly, sweet, expensive floral perfume, with her instantly suffocating the familiar smell of old coffee and Murphy oil soap. Her face was flushed. Her mascara was perfectly smudged. Tears streamed down her cheeks in a flawless manufactured display of panic. She lunged toward the kitchen island, throwing her arms out to grab our father. "Dad! Oh my God, Dad!" Vanessa wailed, her voice cracking with pure theatrical desperation. "The hospital would not tell us anything. Sheriff Marcus said an ambulance was on the street this morning. I thought you were dead." It was an Oscar-worthy performance, but Arthur did not reach out to catch her. He did not move a single muscle. He sat on his stool like a block of weathered granite, his hands resting flat on the counter. He just stared at her. His eyes were completely hollow. He tilted his chin up just a fraction. His voice was a dry, scraping rasp. "You could have just called Lexi." Vanessa froze. Her outstretched arms dropped to her sides. The panicked, tearful expression on her face hardened like fast-drying cement. The mask of the grieving daughter hit the floor and shattered into a million jagged pieces. Derek stepped into the kitchen right behind her. He wore a designer quarter-zip sweater and expensive leather loafers. He immediately moved to shield his wife, stepping up to the counter and pointing a manicured finger at the old man. "You are slipping, Colonel," Derek said. He used that condescending, authoritative tone that weak men use when they think they have the upper hand. "You are forgetting your pills. You are missing your doctor appointments. You are getting confused. We are just looking out for you." Gaslighting, straight out of a textbook. Vanessa pivoted. She turned her guns entirely on me. The fake tears were gone. Her eyes narrowed, burning with naked, ugly venom. "You did this!" Vanessa spat, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "We are trying to protect him. But ever since you moved back, you brought that sick, twisted military discipline into this house. You keep him locked up. You screen his phone calls. You isolate him from his own family." She was weaponizing my sacrifice. I gave up a major promotion at the Pentagon. I packed my life into cardboard boxes and moved back to this rusty Ohio town to sort his medications, clean his surgical wounds, and make sure he ate something other than canned soup. I did the grueling, thankless grunt work of keeping an old man alive. She called it brainwashing. She was desperately trying to whitewash her own suffocating greed under the guise of elder protection. I did not flinch. I did not take the bait. I stood exactly where I was, my boots planted shoulder width apart. I clasped my hands loosely behind my back in a standard parade rest. I kept my breathing slow and even. I just watched her. I let her scream. I let her hurl accusations. I let her voice bounce off the tile walls until her lungs burned and her throat went hoarse. When you deal with a hostile target, you never interrupt them when they are making a mistake. You let them expose their entire flank. Finally, she ran out of breath. The kitchen fell into a heavy, dead silence. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. I held her gaze. I did not blink. When I spoke, my voice was completely flat, cold, stripped of any sisterly affection. You do not care about his health, Vanessa. I paused, letting the silence stretch out for one brutal second. You just care about the deed to this house. The sniper shot landed dead center. It punctured her bloated, hypocritical bubble instantly. Vanessa's jaw actually slacked. Her mouth hung open. She searched for a comeback, but her brain short-circuited. You cannot argue with the absolute unvarnished truth. Beside me, my father looked at his eldest daughter. He did not look at her with sadness or disappointment. He looked at her the way a soldier looks at a traitor caught selling secrets to the enemy. Total, visceral disgust. Realizing the victim card was burned to ash, Vanessa bared her teeth. The suburban housewife facade melted away, revealing the raw predator underneath. I am the eldest, she snarled, her voice dropping into a low, vicious register. I am not going to stand by and let some brainwashed little sister isolate my father and steal what belongs to me. We are done playing nice. We filed the paperwork this morning. Conservatorship. See you in court. She spun on her heel. Derek scurried right after her, a coward, following the apex predator out the door. The heavy oak front door slammed shut. The impact rattled the framed photographs hanging in the hallway. Arthur slowly lowered his head. He braced his elbows on the counter and buried his face in his large, scarred hands. The kitchen was quiet again, but it was the silence of a bombed-out bunker. I did not move to comfort him. I walked over to the front window and watched their luxury SUV speed out of the driveway, the tires throwing loose gravel into the street. The threat was not empty. Less than 18 hours later, the morning frost was still clinging to the front porch when a heavy knock echoed through the house. I opened the door. A bored-looking guy in a cheap nylon windbreaker stood on the welcome mat. He held a thick manila envelope in his hand. Arthur Harper, he asked, looking past me. I will take it, I said. He shoved the envelope into my chest, turned around, and walked back to his idling sedan without another word. A process server. I carried the heavy stack of papers into the kitchen and dropped it onto the granite island. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Right on the front page, glaring up at us in bold black ink, was a petition for emergency guardianship. Next to it was a bright red court stamp. The legal war had officially begun. Vanessa did not just want the house. She wanted to weaponize the natural biological cracks of an aging body. To fight the emergency conservatorship, my father was forced to undergo a cognitive evaluation, a state-mandated mental health screening. I stood at attention in the sterile hallway of the clinic. The pale, buzzing fluorescent lights beat down on the cheap vinyl floor. Through the crack in the heavy wooden door, I listened to the humiliation unfold. A fresh-faced doctor, probably 30 years younger than my father, was sitting across from a man who used to coordinate artillery strikes. The doctor spoke in that slow, condescending tone people reserve for toddlers and the elderly. What day of the week is it, Mr. Harper? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? Can you tell me the name of this object? My stomach twisted into a hard, cold knot. My fingernails bit into the palms of my hands. He answered every single question correctly. But his voice, that deep, booming baritone that used to echo across parade decks, was completely gone. It was small, hesitant, shaking with a quiet, devastating shame. When we finally walked out into the parking lot, the gray, suffocating winter sky over Cincinnati seemed to physically crush him. The wind off the Ohio River was brutal. Arthur walked to the passenger side of the SUV, but he did not pull the handle. He just stopped. He leaned his heavy weight against the cold, freezing metal of the door, his chin dropping to his chest. He stared down at the dirty slush gathering around his worn leather boots. Lexi, he rasped, his voice cracked thick with an agonizing grief. I commanded an entire Marine infantry battalion. I held the lives of 1,000 men in my hands. And today at 68 years old, I am getting graded on whether I can remember the word for a damn chair. A single tear spilled over his lower lid, cutting a clean track through the deep wrinkles on his weathered cheek. It was the hardest thing I'd ever watched. Bullets and shrapnel leave clean holes you can pack with gauze. This was different. Vanessa was not just trying to steal his retirement fund. She was actively murdering his dignity. She was stripping a proud old soldier naked in the public square just to pick his pockets. I did not offer him a tissue. I did not offer him a hug. I opened the door for him, a silent show of respect, and waited until he climbed inside. But the courtroom was not the only battlefield. The court of public opinion was already taking fire. 2 days later, I was walking down the produce aisle at the local supermarket. The harsh grocery store lights reflected off the polished linoleum. I was tossing a bag of apples into my cart when I saw her. Margaret, my aunt, Vanessa's biggest cheerleader and a fanatic believer in the rights of the eldest child. She took one look at me from the far end of the aisle, grabbed a random bunch of celery she did not even look at, and practically sprinted the other way. She pretended I did not exist. I was the ghost haunting the family. It got worse at the checkout line. I was pushing my cart toward Register 4 when Beatrice Lawson deliberately stepped into my path. Beatrice was the president of the local women's club, a bored wealthy suburbanite who treated neighborhood gossip like an Olympic sport. She jammed the front of her shopping cart directly against mine. The metal wire baskets crashed together with a loud, ugly rattle. She did not move. She looked me up and down, her eyes crawling over my plain utility jacket and jeans. Her mouth curled into a nasty, probing sneer. Hearing some terrible things about the Colonel's mind these days, Beatrice said loudly, loud enough for the cashier and the people in the next line to hear. They say he is really slipping. You are keeping a pretty tight leash on him, aren't you, Lexi? Not letting anyone else in the house. The local rumor mill was fully weaponized. The societal bias was doing exactly what Vanessa wanted. It nailed me to the cross. It painted me as the cruel, domineering military daughter holding her fragile old father hostage. Beatrice stood there, her hands gripping her cart, waiting for me to get defensive. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to scramble to explain myself, to plead my case so she could report back to her country club friends about how unhinged I looked. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly straight. In the military, explaining yourself to a hostile idiot is a massive waste of tactical resources. You do not negotiate with a brick wall. You bypass it. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not blink. I reached out, grabbed the front of her shopping cart, and shoved it hard to the left. The wheels squealed against the linoleum as her cart slid out of my way. Beatrice gasped, stumbling back a half step. I did not utter a single syllable. I pushed my cart right past her, leaving her standing there with her mouth hanging open in the middle of the frozen food section. Total, unapologetic contempt is always silent. I walked out into the freezing parking lot. The cold air hit my face like a slap. I unlocked the SUV, grabbed the plastic grocery bags, and threw them into the trunk. I slammed the heavy tailgate shut. The metallic crash echoed across the empty asphalt. Playing defense was over. Absorbing hits was over. If Vanessa wanted to use a cheap, slimy lawyer to steal my father's rights, I was not going to sit around and wait for the judge to swing the gavel. I walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the heater blasting cold air against my face. I slammed the shifter into drive. I was going to buy the biggest, most ruthless legal cannon in the state of Ohio. I hit the gas, pointing the hood of the truck straight toward the downtown office of Eleanor Caldwell. Eleanor Caldwell did not keep a box of tissues on her desk. She was a former state prosecutor, a woman who viewed tears as a tactical disadvantage and treated pleasantries like a waste of billable hours. Her office smelled like expensive leather, old paper, and ozone. The harsh neon overheads hummed loudly, casting sharp, unflattering shadows across her heavy glass-topped desk. She lifted a thick, rubber-banded stack of bank statements and dropped it. The heavy smack of paper hitting glass echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. They did not file for an emergency conservatorship because they give a damn about your blood pressure, Colonel, Eleanor stated. Her voice was flat, devoid of any bedside manner. They filed it to cover up a crater. I dragged the stack across the glass toward me. I flipped the cover page. My eyes locked onto the columns. Red ink, endless lines of it bleeding down the pages in systematic increments. $187,000. Gone, evaporated. A lifetime of pension checks, combat pay, and quiet sacrifices systematically siphoned out over 12 months. The wire transfers were practically screaming off the page. The money was funneled directly into a shell LLC tied to Derek's suffocating venture capital firm. A garbage tech startup built on bad debt-leased luxury cars and suburban arrogance. My father stared at the numbers. He blinked slow and confused like a man waking up from a severe concussion. He shoved the papers away, his hand trembling. "How?" he rasped. "I never wrote a single check to that bastard. My checkbook stays locked in the safe." Eleanor reached into her leather briefcase. She did not flinch. She pulled out a single thin sheet of paper and slid it forward. A temporary medical and financial power of attorney. I leaned in, bottom right corner. The signature belonged to Arthur Harper, but the ink was jagged, crooked. The letters dragged and trailed off, lacking the firm authoritative pressure he usually applied to a pen. My stomach plummeted into absolute zero. I knew exactly when that pen hit the paper. Last November. The aortic valve rupture. My father was lying flat on a hospital gurney, pumped full of morphine, fighting for every shallow breath while waiting for emergency open-heart surgery. I was stuck on a forward operating base thousands of miles away, gripping a satellite phone, staring at the desert dirt, completely helpless. Vanessa was there. She leaned over his stretcher in the prep room. She put a pen in his trembling hand and told him it was just standard hospital bureaucracy. Just a simple form so she could handle the co-pays and deal with the insurance company if things went sideways on the operating table. There was no forgery, no fake ID. She stood in that sterile room watching a surgeon trace a line down her father's sternum with a surgical marker, and she used that exact moment of mortal terror to secure the keys to his bank accounts. She took the piece of paper he signed in blind, desperate trust and walked straight to a bank teller. The drive back to the house was dead silent. The heater in the SUV roared, but the cab of the truck felt like a meat locker. When we finally got inside the psychological perimeter my father had maintained for 68 years buckled, I found him sitting on the edge of his mattress in the dark. The street lamp outside cast long prison bar shadows through the window blinds. He was hunched over his massive shoulders, shaking. His calloused hands were gripped tight around a cheap plastic picture frame. An old, faded photo of Vanessa in a white graduation dress. "Lexi," he mumbled to the floor. His voice was completely hollowed out, a ghost of a man. Am I actually losing my mind? Did I tell her she could have it? Did I give him the money to save his business and I just forgot? That is the ultimate venom of a betrayal like this. It does not just empty your wallet. It makes you the villain in your own memory. It makes you question your own sanity. I felt a hot, blinding surge of rage. For the first time since this nightmare started, a single tear burned its way down my cheek. Not from sadness, from pure, concentrated, violent anger. I dropped to one knee on the hardwood floor. I reached out and clamped both my hands over his. His knuckles were ice cold. I squeezed hard, grounding him back to reality. If you have ever had a family member use your trust as a weapon against you, if you have ever been manipulated into doubting your own sanity by someone sharing your last name, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below and just type, "I see it." Let me know I am not the only one who has had to pull a loved one out of this kind of psychological hell. I looked dead into his faded, bloodshot eyes. I did not soften my voice. I did not sugarcoat a damn thing. I gave him the clinical truth. It was the only medicine strong enough to stop the rot. "Listen to me, Colonel," I said, my voice cutting through the dark room like a serrated blade. "You are not slipping. You did not forget a thing. The truth is your eldest daughter did not need to forge a document. She used your trust and your love as a knife, and she stabbed you right in the back." What finally woke the apex predator inside my father was not my harsh dose of reality. It was the sheer breathtaking stupidity of the enemy. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. An encrypted email from Eleanor Caldwell. She had already started ripping into Derek's failing venture capital firm, and she found a leak. A former assistant recently fired without severance happily handed over a trove of internal communications. Included in that file was a screenshot of a text exchange between Derek and Vanessa, dated 2 days after the hospital stun. I printed the screenshot. I placed the warm sheet of paper flat on the granite island in front of my father. Derek had been nervous. His text read, "If this blows up, the old man is going to tear us apart." Vanessa's response was dripping with the kind of arrogant, unearned confidence that only a spoiled child possesses. She wrote, "Relax. He is way too proud to drag this out in public. He always covers for me. He will bite his tongue and eat the financial loss just to protect the family honor. We are fine." I watched Arthur read the words. He did not cry this time. He did not hunch over. The biological shift in the room was palpable. I could actually see the exact second the grieving father died and the Marine colonel resurrected. The muscles in his forearms coiled tight. His jaw locked with a hard, audible click. Vanessa did not just steal his retirement fund. She looked at his lifelong capacity for forgiveness, his quiet, stoic protection of his family, and she labeled it cowardice. She thought he was a weak, easily manipulated mark. Arthur placed his large hand flat over the printed paper. He smoothed out a small crease in the corner. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer a hollow rasp. It was a deep, guttural rumble. The sound of heavy artillery loading in the dark. That, Arthur said, his eyes dark and entirely cold, is the one thing they completely miscalculated about a soldier. I seized the momentum. I turned and walked straight down the hall to the master bedroom. I opened the heavy cedar closet. The smell of mothballs and old leather filled the air. I reached into the back and pulled out the thick vinyl garment bag. I unzipped it. The heavy dark blue wool of his Marine Corps dress alphas absorbed the light in the room. The brass buttons were meticulously polished. The ribbon rack on the left breast was perfectly flat, a colorful map of surviving absolute hell. I carried the uniform back into the kitchen and laid it across the back of a chair. The heavy brass buttons clinked sharply against the wood. "Put it on, Colonel," I said, my voice dead even. "We are going out." 30 minutes later, I steered the SUV into the gravel parking lot of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The VFW was not a country club. It was a windowless cinder-block bunker sitting on the edge of the county line. The neon Pops blue ribbon sign buzzed violently in the front window. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. The smell hit us instantly. Stale draft beer, cheap floor wax, and decades of embedded cigar smoke. It was the smell of survival. The smell of men who did not give a damn about what neighborhood you lived in or what car you drove. Nobody in this room was going to ask my father to count backward by sevens. Nobody was going to ask him to name a plastic chair. We stepped into the dim light of the bar. There were about a dozen old men scattered around the room. Pool balls cracked loudly in the back. A baseball game played on a muted television. Then an old guy in a faded navy ball cap looked toward the door. He saw the dark blue wool. He saw the blood stripe running down the trousers. He saw the silver star on the chest. The Navy vet set his thick glass beer mug down on the wooden bar. He stood up. A ripple went through the room. One by one, pool cues were set down. Bar stools scraped against the linoleum. 12 men, their bodies battered by age and war, stood up. Their spines straightened, shoulders pulled back. The Navy vet raised his right hand in a crisp, rigid salute. "Good morning, sir!" He barked, his voice echoing off the low ceiling. "Good morning, sir!" The rest of the room echoed in unison. Arthur stood tall. The slump in his shoulders was entirely gone. His chest expanded, filling out the heavy wool uniform. He raised his hand and returned the salute with flawless mechanical precision. "As you were, gentlemen," Arthur rumbled. The tension broke. The men crowded around. They clapped him on the shoulder. They handed him a glass of dark amber beer. They talked about deployments, about awful chain of command, about the things only they understood. I stepped back against the paneled wall. I crossed my arms and watched. The humiliation of the hospital clinic was washed away completely. The predator was fully awake and his lungs were full of air. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, we were back in Theodore's law office. The air conditioning hummed aggressively. Theodore slid a crisp, freshly printed stack of legal documents across the oak desk. "This is the new last will and testament, Arthur," Theodore said, tapping a silver pen on the paper. "It explicitly disinherits Vanessa Harper and her spouse. It revokes all previous medical and financial proxies. It permanently cuts her out of the estate. She will not get a single dime, and she will not have the legal authority to authorize a Band-Aid for you." Arthur did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He took the silver pen, he pressed the tip to the paper, and signed his name. The strokes were not shaky or crooked this time. They were deep, aggressive slashes of black ink that nearly tore through the thick parchment. Right as he finished, Theodore's desk phone rang. Theodore glanced at the caller ID. "That is Vanessa's attorney. They are calling to propose a closed-door settlement. They want to avoid a public hearing." Arthur looked at me. His eyes were like chipped ice. He gave me one short, ironclad nod. "Let it ring," I told Theodore. "We are not settling a damn thing." I picked up the heavy ring of keys from the desk. The legal artillery was fully loaded. We walked out of the office, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind us. We stepped into the freezing Ohio wind, walked to the truck, and aimed the hood straight toward the Hamilton County Courthouse. The hearing took place on a gray, miserable Thursday morning. The Hamilton County Courthouse smelled exactly like what it was, a slow grinding machine for broken families. The air inside the heavy stone building was thick and stale, carrying the harsh chemical sting of industrial bleach, mixed with the smell of cheap floor wax and centuries of nervous sweat soaked into old oak panels. My father pushed open the heavy double doors of courtroom 3B. He walked with a wooden cane, his bad titanium knee stiff in the damp Ohio weather, but his posture was absolute iron. He moved down the center aisle, his chin up his chest broad. He looked less like an old man showing up for a competency hearing, and more like a commanding officer reviewing his troops on a parade deck. I followed a half step behind him, keeping my eyes locked dead ahead. At the plaintiff's table across the room, Vanessa, Derek, and Aunt Margaret were huddled together, whispering furiously. Vanessa wore a conservative navy blazer and a string of pearls. She was playing the part, trying to look like the responsible, exhausted, deeply concerned eldest daughter. But when she looked up and caught the razor blade glare from my father, her act cracked. She physically flinched. She snapped her head down suddenly, very interested in a blank legal pad, her shoulders tense. Derek shifted in his expensive leather chair, adjusting his tie, refusing to make eye contact. I pulled out a heavy, creaking wooden chair for the colonel. I sat down next to him. I planted my boots flat on the floor, squared my shoulders, and placed my hands neatly on my thighs. It was a court-martial parade rest. I kept my breathing slow, regulating my heart rate, tuning out the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Vanessa's attorney stood up. He was a slick, aggressive guy in a tailored gray suit who looked like he billed by the syllable. He did not waste time. He launched his cross-examination with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He paced back and forth in front of the witness stand, his leather dress shoes squeaking sharply against the polished wood floor. He started painting a pathetic manufactured picture of my father, a fragile, deeply confused old man trapped in his own home, losing his grip on reality. Then the lawyer pivoted. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me. "Your Honor, the respondent is being isolated," the lawyer said, his voice oozing with a fake, practiced sympathy. "His youngest daughter, Major Harper, has imposed a strict, militant lockdown on the property. She screens his phone calls. She dictates his daily schedule. She's using military discipline to manipulate a sick, vulnerable man who no longer has the capacity to advocate for himself." I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I just stared a hole straight through his expensive silk tie. The lawyer turned his back to me and faced my father. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slapped it down hard on the heavy wooden podium. Smack. The sharp sound echoed off the high ceiling. "Colonel Harper," the lawyer pressed, leaning over the podium like a shark smelling blood in the water. "This is a power of attorney, signed by you, granting full financial and medical control to your eldest daughter. You signed this willingly, did you not?" Because you trusted her to handle your affairs when you realized your mind was beginning to fail. It was a textbook catch-22, a legal trap designed to back an old man into a corner. If my father said he did not know what he was signing on that hospital gurney, he was admitting on the record to severe cognitive decline. If he said he did know what he was signing, he validated Vanessa's absolute ironclad authority over his bank accounts. The courtroom went dead quiet. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair, looked down from the bench waiting. Arthur did not look at the slick lawyer. He turned his heavy head slowly and locked eyes directly with his eldest daughter, sitting 10 feet away. "I used to trust her," Arthur said. His voice was a flat, freezing, absolute zero. At the plaintiff's table, Derek exhaled a loud, exaggerated breath of relief. He leaned back in his chair, acting like the trial was already over. Aunt Margaret, sitting in the gallery right behind them, crossed her arms and shot me a smug, vindictive smirk. Vanessa actually smiled. Just a tiny, triumphant twitch of her lips. She thought she had him boxed in. She thought that piece of paper was her impenetrable shield. They thought they had won. I kept my face completely blank, a perfect poker face. But deep down, the predator inside me let out a low, quiet hum of satisfaction. I allowed the corner of my mouth to curl up just a fraction of an inch. In military tactics, there is a concept known as a fatal funnel. When the enemy gets arrogant, they make mistakes. When they confidently march their entire formation out into an open field, convinced of their own invincibility, they stop looking for traps. That is the exact moment you call in the heavy artillery and wipe them off the map. They did not realize that the power of attorney was not their armor. It was their death warrant. I turned my head a quarter inch and gave Eleanor Caldwell a single, silent nod. Eleanor stood up from our table. She did not button her suit jacket. She did not address the opposing counsel with any fake professional courtesy. She bypassed the legal foreplay entirely. She grabbed a thick stack of bank statements from our desk. The edges of the paper were bound tightly in bright red legal tape. Eleanor walked straight toward the center of the floor, holding the heavy stack of papers in her right hand like a loaded weapon. She did not argue the validity of the signature on the power of attorney. She did not claim my father was confused or drugged on that operating table. She took their own weapon, flipped the blade, and turned it into a legal noose to hang them with. She stopped right in front of the plaintiff's table. "Ms. Harper," Eleanor's voice cracked through the stale courtroom air, sharp and jagged as broken glass. She stared Vanessa down, her eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Since you and your counsel are relying so heavily on this specific document, let us clarify its boundaries for the record." Eleanor raised the red-bound bank statements high in the air, preparing to drop the bomb right in the middle of the room. "Please tell the court," Eleanor demanded, the volume of her voice rising to a lethal, echoing pitch. "Exactly what is the legal limit of this authority?" Eleanor tapped her index finger against the thick stack of bank statements. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was rhythmic, mechanical, and grating. It sounded exactly like a drill bit grinding into the heavy oak podium. She stared at Vanessa, who was now shifting uncomfortably in her leather chair. "Ms. Harper," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a deadly conversational register. "Does this power of attorney authorize you to pay your father's medical bills?" Vanessa swallowed hard. Her throat clicked. "Yes." "Does it authorize you to pay his property taxes and basic utilities?" "Yes." Eleanor stopped tapping. She slammed her bare hand flat onto the red-bound folder. "Then please point out exactly which paragraph authorized you to wire $187,000 into your husband's failing venture capital LLC. The oxygen in courtroom 3B simply vanished. "And while you are looking," Eleanor added, her voice turning sharp and jagged as broken glass, "maybe you can find the clause that authorized $3,000 in cash withdrawals for luxury retail shopping. The exact same week your father was recovering from open-heart surgery." Silence. A heavy, suffocating, dead silence. Vanessa's face instantly drained of color. The blood left her cheeks, leaving a sickly, pale white mask. She looked like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. Her mouth opened and closed, but only a pathetic, raspy squeak came out. Her high-priced attorney scrambled. He half stood, his hands fluttering over his legal pads, desperately trying to formulate an objection. But he had absolutely nothing. You cannot object to a bank wire receipt. The judge, a stern woman with steel gray hair, looked over her reading glasses. Her face was set in absolute stone. Does the respondent wish to speak? I did not need to help him. Arthur planted his wooden cane flat on the floor. He pushed his heavy frame up. The joints in his titanium knee popped loud and sharp in the quiet room. He stood at full attention, squaring his broad shoulders to the bench. I do, Your Honor, Arthur rumbled. He did not look at the judge. He turned his heavy, weathered face directly toward the plaintiff's table. He locked eyes with his eldest daughter. She claims she was confused, Arthur said. His voice carried the heavy, measured weight of a eulogy. She claims she filed this petition out of concern for my declining health. He gripped the handle of his cane. The knuckles on his scarred hand went bone white. An enemy in the dirt will try to take your life. That is war. I made peace with that decades ago. But my own daughter. He paused. His jaw tightened into a knot of pure iron. My own daughter danced on my fake grave at 7:20 in the morning while I was sitting 3 feet away, still breathing. The verdict was not delivered by the judge. It was delivered by the sheer, crushing weight of reality. The victim masks shattered entirely. Panic set in, and panic makes rats turn on each other. Vanessa physically recoiled from her father's stare. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide and wild, looking for a human shield. She found Derek. It was him, Vanessa shrieked. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger right in her husband's face, her voice cracking into an ugly sob. He told me to transfer the money. His company was drowning. He made me do it. Derek's pristine country club composure disintegrated on the spot. Cornered, he bared his teeth like a trapped possum. He shoved his heavy chair back so hard it crashed loudly into the wooden railing behind him. Do not throw me under the bus, you crazy bitch, Derek roared. His face flushed dark, angry red. He pointed right back at her, airing their dirty laundry in front of God the judge and 20 strangers. You knew exactly what we were doing. You told me he was too damn proud to ever ask for the money back. You said he would eat the loss for the family. The gallery erupted. A wave of disgusted whispers and quiet gasps washed over the wooden benches. Aunt Margaret sat completely frozen in the back row. Her smug, vindictive smirk was wiped clean off her face. She stared at her niece like she was looking at a stranger, a monster. Bang, bang, bang. The judge hammered her wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp cracks echoed like gunfire. Quiet in my courtroom, the judge barked. She glared down at the plaintiff's table with pure, unadulterated contempt. This petition for emergency conservatorship is denied with prejudice, and I strongly suggest the respondent's counsel forward these financial records to the district attorney's fraud division. We are adjourned. The war was over. The empire of lies was burned straight to the ground. I stood up. I buttoned my utility jacket, grabbed my father's elbow to steady him, and we walked down the center aisle. We did not spare a single glance at the wreckage left at the plaintiff's table. We pushed through the heavy oak doors into the hallway. The marble floors echoed with our footsteps. Lexi! The desperate, screeching voice bounced off the corridor walls. I stopped. I turned around slowly. Vanessa was practically running out of the courtroom. Her expensive heels slipped on the polished stone. Her hair was a mess. Her pearl necklace sat crooked against her collar. She was desperately trying to salvage one last pathetic scrap of pride. She lunged toward me, grabbing the sleeve of my jacket with a shaking hand. You brainwashed him, she hissed, her breath, ragged spit flying from her lips. You turned him against his own family. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached over and shoved her hand off my coat with a sharp, violent flick of my wrist. She stumbled back a half step, her shoulder hitting the cold marble wall. I stepped directly into her space. My eyes were cold, dead, and entirely empty of mercy. You stripped yourself of your rank as his daughter the second you hung up that phone. I said, my voice dropping to a frozen whisper. He was sitting right next to me when you celebrated his death. Do not ever dirty the Harper name again. I held her gaze for one more second, watching the last flicker of arrogance completely die in her eyes. She stood completely paralyzed, her mouth hanging open in a silent, suffocating gasp. I turned my back on her. I walked over to the old Marine, offered my arm, and we walked out the front doors into the freezing Ohio air, leaving her buried in the ruins of her own greed. Winning in a courtroom does not heal broken bloodlines. It just establishes the perimeter. The legal fallout was brutal, swift, and completely unsentimental. The financial fraud case ended in a forced civil restitution agreement. Eleanor backed Vanessa into a corner with the threat of federal wire fraud charges. To stay out of handcuffs, Vanessa signed a binding contract to slowly reimburse the stolen $187,000 plus legal fees. Without her father operating as an unlimited blind ATM, the fake suburban empire collapsed. Gravity is undefeated. Derek's garbage venture capital fund completely folded within 4 weeks. The leased luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. They were forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The $1 million mini mansion was listed as a short sale, and they packed their designer luggage into a rented U-Haul, moving into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the highway. For 42 years, Vanessa always had a safety net. Every time she stumbled, made a bad investment, or bought something she could not afford, Arthur was there with his checkbook to pad the landing. This time, I forced him to step back. I stood shoulder to shoulder with him and made him watch the law of karma pull her straight down into the mud. But a true military commander does not operate purely on vengeance. Vengeance is messy. Discipline is precise. Late one night, Arthur sat at the kitchen island staring at the thick stack of revised estate documents. The brass eagle trophy gleamed softly in the overhead light. "The Harper kids did not do this," Arthur mumbled. His voice was heavy, scraping against the quiet room. "The girls did not steal from me." He was talking about his granddaughters, Vanessa's kids. "I know, Colonel," I said. I poured a mug of black decaf and set it down in front of him. He picked up a pen. He did not cross out the college funds. He kept the 529 plans fully funded. However, he legally transferred total control of those accounts to an independent third-party trustee. Not a single penny would ever pass through Vanessa's hands. When the girls turned 18, the trust would pay their university tuition directly to the registrar's office. I completely backed his play. I leaned against the counter, watching him sign the addendum. Bailing out a traitor is not love. It is just weakness. I told him, keeping my voice level. But protecting the next generation with absolute transparency, that is how a commander holds the line. He nodded once slowly and capped the pen. The financial war was over, but the social fallout was just beginning to settle across our small Ohio suburb. Public records are public. The judge's scathing remarks and the denial of the conservatorship spread through the neighborhood gossip mill faster than a brush fire. 2 weeks later, I was back in the grocery store. Same produce aisle, same harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. I was bagging some yellow onions when Aunt Margaret turned the corner. She saw me. 3 weeks ago, she would have glared at me like I was a warden torturing her brother. Today, she physically flinched. She dropped her gaze to the scuffed linoleum, yanked her shopping cart into a hard U-turn, and practically jogged down the cereal aisle just to avoid my line of sight. 10 minutes later, I walked out the automatic sliding doors and spotted Beatrice Lawson loading groceries into her minivan. The great loud-mouthed president of the women's club. When she heard the squeak of my cart, she froze. She did not puff up her chest. She did not block my path. She slammed her trunk shut, kept her head down, and refused to make eye contact as I walked past. I did not stop. I did not demand an apology. The military taught me a very simple, undeniable truth. Reality is the only weapon that never needs to explain itself. They knew exactly what Vanessa had tried to do, and they knew they had eagerly cheered for the villain. Their humiliated, terrified silence was the only victory lap I needed. I loaded my truck, slammed the tailgate, and drove home. The winter thawed out. The Ohio snow turned into heavy spring rain. The house settled back into a quiet, structured rhythm. 4 months after the trial, I walked out to the metal mailbox at the end of the driveway. Mixed in with the junk mail and the utility bills was a small square envelope made of cheap blue construction paper. I carried the stack inside and dropped it on the granite counter. Arthur picked up the blue envelope. He opened it carefully with his thick, scarred thumb. Inside was a handmade birthday card. The front was decorated with crooked crayon-drawn stars. Inside, in messy, oversized third-grade handwriting, it read, "Happy birthday, Grandpa. I love you." It was from his youngest granddaughter. Arthur did not say a word. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, tracing the wobbly crayon letters with his index finger. The tight, rigid lines of stress around his eyes finally softened. He reached up and used a plastic magnet to pin the fragile blue card directly to the center of the stainless steel refrigerator door. Right below it, sitting flat on the counter, was a crisp white envelope. It contained a clinical court-mandated restitution check for $850. Signed by Vanessa. I picked up the white envelope. The paper felt cold, dead, meaningless. I looked back at the refrigerator. My father was still standing there, staring at the crooked crayon stars. A quiet, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. The heavy, suffocating shadow that had crushed his shoulders for the last 8 months was completely gone. The war was over. The perimeter was secure. The old soldier was finally coming home. 8 months passed. The brutal Ohio winter finally melted into a humid, sticky summer and then broke into a crisp, biting autumn. The dust had completely settled. One Tuesday afternoon, my father's cell phone vibrated against the granite counter. It was a text from Vanessa. She wanted to meet. She asked for neutral territory. A cheap chain diner just off Interstate 71. I leaned against the refrigerator, arms crossed, and told him to go. You cannot barricade a man from his own blood forever. Eventually, he had to look her in the eye one last time to fully close the door. He needed to hear it for himself. He put on his heavy canvas jacket and took the truck. He was gone for exactly 45 minutes. When he walked back through the front door, the crippling invisible weight that had dragged on his shoulders for nearly a year was gone. He shrugged off his jacket, hung it on the brass hook by the door, and walked into the kitchen. He sat heavily on his stool. She tried to play the hits. Arthur grunted, rubbing his bad titanium knee. Blamed the crippling debt, blamed Derek's bad investments, blamed the stress of the mortgage. Played the desperate housewife card. He paused. He looked out the window at the dying brown oak leaves scattered across the yard. But I did not give her an inch, Lexi. I just sat there. I stared at her over a cup of burnt coffee until she ran completely out of excuses. And then she finally broke. He looked back at me. His eyes were clear, cold, but clear. She looked down at her hands and said it. I started dividing up what you had while you were still breathing. The ugly, naked truth, spoken out loud in a dirty diner. It was the final nail hammered into the coffin of any lingering illusions. My father forgave her. He did it quietly in his own mind for his own peace. Carrying hate is like carrying a rucksack full of rocks. Eventually, it destroys your own spine. But an iron boundary was permanently dropped into the concrete. There was no grand, tearful reconciliation, no Hollywood ending, no hugging in a parking lot while the rain washed away their sins. That is movie garbage. In the real world, actions have permanent, unalterable consequences. Vanessa was forgiven as a human being, but she was permanently locked out of the command center. No financial access, no legal authority, no spare keys to the front door. We understood a fundamental, brutal truth that most families refuse to accept. Forgiveness is just cracking the door open enough to see each other. It is acknowledging the humanity of the person who hurt you. It is never ever handing the keys back to the person who already stabbed you in the back. My father was getting older. That was an undeniable biological fact. His knee ached when the barometer dropped. He took his nitroglycerin pills every morning. He walked a little slower, but he was no longer a victim waiting to be exploited. He was an independent, proud veteran who dictated the exact terms of his own remaining years. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the house feels solid, impervious. Pale autumn sunlight cut through the kitchen blinds, warming the cold granite countertops. The radiator hissed quietly in the corner of the dining room. We were sitting at the exact same kitchen island where the storm first broke. The smell of strong black drip coffee mixed heavily with the scent of burnt, buttered toast. I took a sip from my ceramic mug. Arthur scraped a butter knife across his toast, the rough sound filling the quiet space. Then the wall-mounted landline shrieked. Ring! Both of us stopped. We froze for a split second. Muscle memory kicked in. A sudden sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest, dragging my brain right back to that awful 7:20 a.m. phone call. Then Arthur slowly lowered his knife. He pointed the butter-smeared blade directly at my chest. The corner of his mouth twitched up into a sharp, dry smirk. "Major Harper, you better answer that." Arthur deadpanned, his voice thick with gravelly, pitch-black humor. "Last time you ignored a phone call, I found out I was KIA." I stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the joke hung in the air. And then I broke. I threw my head back and let out a loud, hard laugh. A real laugh. It bounced off the tile walls, echoing through the entire house. Arthur chuckled, picking up his coffee mug, his eyes crinkling at the corners. That sound, that laughter. That was the real payload. It wasn't keeping the house. It wasn't the courthouse victory. Sitting in our own kitchen drinking cheap black coffee, completely unafraid of a ringing telephone, that was the greatest victory of the entire damn war. Age can strip away a person's physical strength. It can take their hearing, their mobility, and their speed. It is a ruthless thief. But nobody, absolutely nobody, not even your own flesh and blood, has the right to strip away a person's dignity. If you are listening to this and you have ever had to build a concrete wall between yourself and your own family, just to survive, you know the truth. You know that people will call you cold. They will call you unforgiving. Let them talk. Because you know that sometimes protecting yourself and loving your family have to be two completely separate trenches. You can love them from a distance, but you do not let them back inside the wire. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to fight to protect the boundaries of someone you love or even your own, I need you to do something for me. Drop a red heart emoji in the comments right now. Just a simple heart. Let's show each other how many of us are holding the line. And if you want to stand with this community, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is our perimeter. Keep your boundaries strong, keep your head up, and I will see you in the next fight.